Hello everyone. Once upon a time, a gold ring was forged that gave its owner the power to rule the world. But this is not the story you are thinking about. Tonight, we're going to make a new journey to the world of myth and legends. And this time, I take you to Germany to tell you these stories and discover where they come from. I have set up camp in the southwest of Germany, in der Schwarzwald, the Black Forest. It is an atmospheric place, with its own history and local legends. We'll talk about this too. And a good place to tell you about Germanic and Norse mythologies. We'll see how the two are closely related. And we will do it through the Ring of the Nibelung, which in itself is not an ancient myth. It is the name given to a cycle of operas by Richard Wagner, the Rhinegold, the Valkyrie, Siegfried and Twilight of the Gods. These operas are monuments of music from the 19th century, and they are very much a product of their time, which is yet another thing we will discuss. But we're going to focus on the stories they contain, which are a reinvention of way older myths that will make us travel in time and explore a world of heroes, gods, fairies, and grand scenery, from the rivers and forests of Germany to the fjords and mountains of Scandinavia. We have so much to discuss that you should now adopt a comfortable position and focus for a minute on your breathing and on releasing the tension in your shoulders. The sounds from the campfire have now disappeared, but they will return when I am done talking to lull you to sleep. As always, you can navigate with the timestamps in the first comment if you wish to come back later, or go straight to a particular section. In the first comment, you will also find links to Spotify and Apple Music. You know that you can listen to my stories on these platforms and a few others if this is convenient for you. And the link to my Patreon too, if you wish to support the channel, vote in exclusive polls, send me messages, download the stories to have them offline, and also now listen to them as podcasts. This is a new feature that I just added. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Close your eyes if you wish to. Visuals are not necessary to follow along. And listen. Let's begin with the first story, the Rhinegold. Once upon a time, so far in the past that men have almost lost memories of these events, a dwarf from the clan of the Nibelung emerged from a chasm near the Rhine River. He was short, hairy and ugly, but hoped he would be able to seduce the delightful Rhine maidens, 3 beautiful nymphs who lived in the river and spent their time watching its waters and playing in the flow. The dwarf tried to woo them, but the maidens were unimpressed they mocked his advances, and as he began to chase them, they teased and humiliated him. But suddenly, a ray of sunshine pierced the waters, and a dazzling beam of golden light illuminated the scene. The sun had revealed the Rhinegold. The dwarf asked what it was, and the maidens answered that this gold had been given to them to guard by their father, and that it could be made into a magic ring that would give its bearer power to rule the world, but only if the bearer renounced love first. The dwarf was lustful, and the maidens thought they had nothing to fear from him, because he would never renounce love. But they were reckless. He had been so embittered by their mockery and their games that he cursed love, took the gold, and swiftly returned to his chasm, leaving the maidens dismayed and crying over their lost treasure. Some time later, another scene took place on a mountain top, involving Wotan, the ruler of the gods. Wotan was the most powerful and revered of all gods. He ruled over sorcery, wisdom, knowledge, and healing, and also war and victory. His wife was Frigga, and this day Frigga was worried because Wotan had ordered the building of a new castle worthy of his glory to two giants, and as payment for their work, he had promised to give them Freya, the goddess of youth and beauty, who was also Frigga's sister. Wotan had never really intended to give them Freya as payment. He offered her just to convince them to build the castle, and he had hoped that an alternative would be found. Freya was particularly precious to the gods, not only as Frigga's sister, but also because she gave them golden apples that kept the gods eternally young. But Wotan had been imprudent, because now the giants were coming to claim their due, and he was bound by his promise. His authority was sustained by the treaties and contracts carved into his spear, including the contract with the two giants. He could not withdraw his promise. Other gods were called to try and find a solution, including Donner, god of thunder, Fro, god of sunshine, and Loge, demigod of fire. Loge was known for being astute and a trickster, so Wotan hoped that he would come up with an alternative payment that the giants would accept. When Loge arrived, he told the other gods that finding an alternative way to pay the two giants was near impossible. Love was the most valuable thing in the world. Freya embodied it, and there was no chance the two giants would compromise for a less valuable prize. However, Loge kept thinking, and he came up with one instance when someone had willingly gave up love for something else. The Nibelung dwarf. He had renounced love to be able to steal the Rhinegold and make a powerful magic ring with it. The giants were becoming impatient and asked for Freya to be delivered immediately. Wotan had to accept for now, but he offered them to exchange Freya later against the Nibelung's gold. The giants agreed, but took Freya with them as a hostage, and they gave the gods only the rest of the day to bring the ring. Otherwise, they would keep Freya forever. Then they left, and immediately the gods began to age and weaken. Without waiting further, Wotan resolved to travel to the dwarf's kingdom with Loge, whose intelligence and gifts may be useful to recover the gold. The Nibelung dwarf lived in Nibelheim, an underground kingdom. With the power of the ring, he had enslaved all the other Nibelung dwarfs, and he terrorized them. He had even increased his powers by forcing his brother to create a magic helmet for him. The helmet could make him invisible or change his form, and he used his power of invisibility to surprise and torment his subjects. The dwarf had always had a cruel and greedy nature, but the power given by the ring, and now this helmet, had made him even worse. Wotan and Loge met him, and he bragged about his powers and his plans to conquer the world, using the power of the ring. However, power had not made him smarter, and Loge took advantage of this. He asked him how he could protect from thieves that may try to steal the ring when he was asleep. The dwarf replied that his helmet would hide him, and also that he could turn into any creature. Loge pretended to have doubts and required a demonstration. Flattered to be able to show off his powers to gods, the dwarf turned into a giant snake. Loge acted impressed, but asked if he could also reduce his size, which could be useful for hiding. The dwarf transformed into a toad to demonstrate that he could, and immediately Wotan and Loge seized him, tied his hands, and dragged him up to the surface. Back at the mountaintop, the gods were now in a better position. They forced the dwarf to exchange all his wealth, including his ring and his helmet, against his freedom. They forced him to summon the other dwarfs, the Nibelungs, to bring up the hoard of gold, and they also took away the helmet and the ring from him. The dwarf was so crushed by his loss that he laid a curse on the ring. Until it should return to him, whoever would possess it would live in anxiety of losing it, and would eventually be robbed or killed. Wotan had now gathered the ransom, and when the giants returned with Freya, he hoped he could give them only the gold and keep the magic helmet and the magic ring to increase his own powers. But the giants insisted they wanted everything. Wotan let go of the helmet first, but was not willing to cede the ring. As the negotiations were about to break, and the giants were preparing to leave with Freya, the earth goddess Erda the mother of Donner and the occasional lover of Wotan, appeared. She urged him to give up the cursed ring, warning him of impending doom if he didn't. Wotan was troubled and finally surrendered. He accepted to give the ring. The two giants took possession of it and immediately began dividing the treasure between them. But the curse was already working. They began to argue over the gold and started a fight, in which one of them died. Wotan was horrified when he saw this. The curse had terrible power and would continue to fall on the ring bearers until the end of times, or until the ring was returned to its creator. Peace had now returned, and Wotan took possession of his castle that he named Valhalla. Fro, the god of sunshine, created a rainbow bridge that stretched to the gate of the castle, and Wotan led all the gods across the bridge to the castle, all except Loge, who stayed outside and ruminated about how treacherous and reckless the gods had been. They had stolen, lied and deceived to satisfy their appetite for wealth and power, spoliating the Rhine maidens who would never see their gold again, the dwarf and the giants. There would be other episodes, and no one would live happily ever after. So this was the story of the Rhinegold, the first of the 4 operas that constitute the Ring of the Nibelung by Wagner. I will tell you the 3 other stories further down the road. We will come back to the operas later, but first, let's take a look at the names of the characters. I use their German names, but they are more famous under their Norse names. Wotan is Odin. His wife, Frigga, is Frigg. Freya is Freya. Donner, the son of Wotan and god of thunder, Thor. Fro, the god of sunshine, is Freyr. And Loge is Loki. It is not just that Wagner borrowed Norse gods for this story. Germanic and Norse mythologies are closely apparented, and they share a broadly similar pantheon and set of beliefs because they have a common origin, and Norse mythology is in fact a branch of Germanic mythology. Let's go back in time to understand where Germanic peoples come from, because the way they have expanded and assimilated others, or be assimilated sometimes, can be a bit confusing. Germanic peoples are a group that is at the same time ethnic and linguistic. They are part of these Indo-European peoples I told you about in many stories, the Celts, the ancient Greeks, or the Romans. They migrated during the Neolithic from the east, and in their case, they settled in what is now the south of Scandinavia, in Denmark, the south of Sweden, and the south of Norway. They left archaeological remains dated from several thousand years in this area, unified probably not politically, but by a culture and similar languages. They didn't let written documents that we know of from this period, and one characteristic of their culture is that they entered the Bronze Age relatively late, probably because the raw materials necessary to produce bronze were not available where they lived. What we call bronze is an alloy. It can be of different types, but it required copper, and there was no copper mining in the region at the time. So the production of bronze only started in the second millennium BC, when Scandinavia became commercially connected by trade routes to the rest of Europe. During this period, which has unprecise dates, roughly from 1800 BC to 500 BC, it seems more differentiation appeared between some of these Germanic tribes. And when the Iron Age began, around 500 BC, several tribes crossed the Baltic Sea or expanded south of Denmark. In these new lands, they encountered Celt peoples that were assimilated or repelled to the west towards France, Great Britain, Spain, or the north of Italy. The expansion was slow, over several centuries, and it is more of a migration than a conquest. And as the Germanic peoples were approaching other cultural areas, their presence began to be acknowledged by civilizations that left written traces about them. The ancient Greeks knew that they lived in the Danube and Rhine regions, but they didn't differentiate them clearly from the Celts, and actually they referred to all of them as Gauls, which for the Romans, who were closer and better informed, was a more specific term for the Celtic inhabitants of roughly modern France and Belgium. Rome and Germanic peoples finally clashed around the beginning of our era. The Romans distinguished between several peoples on their northern frontiers. West to east, there were the Gauls, then Germanic peoples, living in their homeland that the Romans called Germania, between the Rhine and the Vistula rivers. And even further east, another people, the Sarmatians. But the thing that can be confusing is that to the Romans, Germania was a region, and the Germans, its inhabitants, it doesn't exactly reflect the concept of Germanic peoples, which is based primarily on a culture and a language. In fact, Germanic peoples lived beyond the limits of Germania, in Scandinavia and around the Baltic Sea. For a long time, this Roman vision shaped the perception of this Germanic area, until archaeology and the study of linguistics and the understanding of their origins extended the list of Germanic peoples. For example, to the Vikings in Scandinavia, or the Goths who lived further east in what is now Ukraine and Romania. And to make things more complicated, many Germanic peoples migrated outside Germania in the last centuries of the Roman Empire and had a big influence in the countries they invaded or where they established. For example, the Angles and the Saxons in England, or the Franks in France. Also, this Roman vision, and closer to us, the work of historians in the 19th century, may give us a false image of Germanic peoples. The Roman vision, because it was incomplete, the Romans had very little knowledge of what existed north of Germania, in Scandinavia, and east of it in Eastern Europe. And then in the 19th century, in European nations, in order to consolidate the sense of nationhood, many historians and scholars elaborated a national history that required ancestors and a narrative, a glorious one if possible. This is the moment when specific periods were chosen to start a national history. Italy had the Romans, France or the UK had the Celts, and Germany had Germanic peoples. These national histories are not untrue, technically, in the sense that, yes, these peoples are some of the ancestors of modern inhabitants, and they occupied the land that they considered to be theirs, and they left a lot of cultural heritage, including monuments and parts of modern languages. But they are also a choice, because there had been inhabitants in these countries long before the Celts or the Romans or the Greeks, and other migration waves also arrived after. But to take the example of England and France, the pre-Celt period was almost unknown at the time, and the post-Celt period, with Romans and Germanic invasions, was not ancient enough, and also probably not glorious enough. You don't want to acknowledge that your national history begins with foreigners arriving. So they settled for the Celts and began considering these particular peoples as their ancestors. This led to a complete change in reputation, in representation for these ancient cultures. They started to be celebrated, and they still are, from the Vikings to the Celts, the Germans, the Slavs in Russia, the ancient Magyars in Hungary, and so on. And in the process, a lot of modern concepts were more or less attributed to them. For example, a sense of national unity that just didn't exist at the time. There was probably a sense of cultural closeness, but it didn't mean they wished to be unified or that they followed modern frontiers. I am telling you all this because it is important to understand the intention behind the reinvention of Germanic myth in Wagner's works. Beyond music and the celebration of a genuinely rich heritage, there was the intention, the will, to glorify an independent national genius, deeply rooted in time. And the 19th century German nationalists, Wagner was one of them, clearly supported this endeavor. But before we explore this mythology, let's take a look at the second story from the Ring of the Nibelung, the Valkyrie, die Walküre in German. After the last episode, since the gods entered the fortress of Valhalla, Wotan had visited his lover, goddess Erda, the mother of Donner, of Thor. And he had had 9 more daughters with her, called the Valkyries. The Valkyries had been tasked to recover heroes fallen in battle, and bring them to Valhalla, where they would protect the fortress in case it was attacked, especially if one day the Nibelung dwarf recovered his ring. Wotan had also wandered the earth, and he had fathered 2 other children with a mortal woman, twins, a boy called Siegmund and a girl called Sieglinde. The twins had grown separately, and they were unaware of each other. They had lived together with their mother in a forest for a few years. But one day, Sigmund had returned and found their home burned down, his mother killed, he never knew by whom, and his sister gone. He was still a child at the time, and since then he had had no family. Wotan's hope in fathering Sigmund was to have a free hero, unlimited by the gods' treaties and contracts. This free hero would be able to do things for him. For example, recover the magic ring that the surviving giant had kept. This giant had become obsessed and anxious about protecting the ring, as the curse dictated, and he had taken the form of a dragon to watch the gold and the ring in the depth of a cave in the forest. One day, Sigmund, Wotan's twin son, was chased by enemies in a forest. He was wounded, unarmed, a terrible storm was raging, and he needed a place to hide. He found a large dwelling built around a tree in the heart of the forest and entered to hide inside. He collapsed with exhaustion, but shortly after his entrance, his sister Sieglinde arrived. The twins had not seen each other for so long that they didn't realize they were family. They remained unaware that they were siblings. Sieglinde told him that he could stay and rest, but her husband, Hunding, would return soon. As hours passed, the two looked at each other with growing interest and emotion. They began to develop an attraction that should not have existed between siblings. Sigmund told her how he was followed by misfortune, and Sieglinde revealed she had a miserable life too. She had been forced into this marriage with Hunding, and a strange event had happened during the wedding. An old man had appeared and plunged a sword into the trunk of the tree around which the dwelling was built. Neither Hunding or any of his companions had been able to remove the sword, and since then Sieglinde was longing for the hero who would be able to draw the sword and save her. Sieglinde's husband, Hunding, finally returned, and seeing Sigmund, he revealed that he was one of his pursuers. He allowed him to stay for now, but the two would have to fight in the morning. Sieglinde drugged her husband's drink to give Sigmund a chance to escape, but instead, as Hunding was now sleeping, the hero expressed his love for her, and she reciprocated. He then drew the sword from the tree, becoming the first man to be able to do it. This was a powerful magical sword that he named Nothung, and he declared that he would now be Sieglinde's protector. As they continued to exchange kisses and tell their lives, the two realized that they were twins. But their attraction was too strong to resist, and at the risk of defying the laws of nature, They swore eternal love. These events had not gone unnoticed by the gods. Wotan was watching Sigmund, who, he hoped, would be the free hero he needed to accomplish the tasks that his own promises and contracts forbade him to accomplish personally. So he called his favorite Valkyrie daughter, Brunhilde, and instructed her to protect Sigmund in his battle with Sieglinde's husband, Hunding. But as he was giving his instructions, his wife Frigga arrived. She was the goddess of family and moral values, and was displeased by what was happening. She argued that Sigmund and Sieglinde had to be punished for their incest and adultery. She also criticized Wotan for trying to use Sigmund as a pawn who would act in his place, arguing that it was hypocritical of him and an equivalent to breaking his promises. Wotan was taken aback by her arguments and defeated, so he reluctantly agreed to change his orders to Brunhilde, the Valkyrie, and ordered her to give the victory to Hunding, Sieglinde's husband, and take Sigmund to Valhalla, where fallen heroes were gathered. At dawn, Brunhilde arrived on the field where the two men were going to fight, and told Sigmund his death was impending because the gods had taken their decision already, but that she would take him to Valhalla. Sigmund refused to follow her once he would be dead, and Sieglinde desperately pleaded their case. Brunhilde had a good heart under her appearance of a fierce warrior, and she was much moved by their story and genuine love. After hesitating, she decided to defy Wotan's orders and grant victory to Sigmund. The fight began, and with Brunhilde's power helping him, Sigmund quickly overpowered Hunding. But as he was going to kill his opponent, Wotan suddenly appeared. The ruler of gods had kept watching what happened and seen with great displeasure that his own Valkyrie daughter was disobeying his orders. With his spear, he shattered Sigmund's sword, Nothung, and the fight was reversed. Hunding stabbed Sigmund, and the hero died. In anger, Wotan also struck Hunding, leaving no victor to the fight. Afraid of Wotan's wrath, but decided to not abandon Sieglinde, Brunhilde picked up the fragments of the sword and fled the scene on horseback with the surviving twin. Brunhilde called her sisters, the other Valkyries, to gather on the mountain top, where she could beg them for help. But the other Valkyries were too afraid of Wotan to defy him. Desperate with the death of Sigmund, Sieglinde cried and declared that she no longer wanted to live. But Brunhilde revealed to her that she was now pregnant and urged her to stay alive for her child's sake. She announced that he would be a boy and that she would have to name him Siegfried. Then she gave her the fragments of the sword and instructed her to flee as far as possible. Just as Sieglinde was disappearing, Wotan arrived at the scene. The other Valkyries tried to hide their sister, but this was in vain, and Wotan announced that for her punishment she would be stripped of her immortality and become a mortal woman, to be held defenseless and asleep on the mountain, prey to any animal or man that would find her. Brunhilde tried to explain that by disobeying his orders and trying to protect Siegmund, she was merely following his own true desires. Wotan was moved by his daughter's plea and accepted to soften the sentence. She would be held on the mountain, but surrounded with a circle of eternal fire that would protect her from all but the bravest of heroes. Then he made her fall asleep and invoked Loge, the god of fire, to create the circle of perpetual flames around her. And finally, he slowly departed, abandoning to her tragic fate the fallen Valkyrie, doomed by her own humanity. Much more will happen, but for now, let's take a look at the sources of these stories and characters. I told you earlier that Germanic peoples had origins in the south of Scandinavia. And as you can imagine, this is why Norse and Germanic mythologies are apparented. Norse mythology is considered a branch because with the expansion of Germanic peoples in Europe, reaching Central and Eastern Europe, the north of Scandinavia, and various islands, including Iceland, divergence happened, and it was reinforced with Christianization that reached Scandinavia much later. So Norse mythology was kept alive for centuries more. It became associated with the Vikings, and there are a lot of Germanic myths and gods that are pretty well known in popular culture, but under their Norse version. Now the stories I am telling you tonight are not really mythology. They are a reinvention from the 19th century. A good comparison would be with recent movies based on Greek mythology that are entertaining, maybe, but not really considered works of art, like Clash of the Titans or Wrath of the Titans. Wagner used characters, situations, anecdotes and places, but they are completely rearranged in a way that doesn't really follow ancient mythological literature. The source material was a range of ancient Germanic and Norse sources, laid in writing in the Middle Ages. For the first two stories I told you, the Rhinegold and the Valkyrie, a lot of the material comes from two bodies of work, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. The Poetic Edda is a collection of old Norse poems. They are anonymous, and they tell about fragments of Norse mythology in a way that can be compared with epic poems from ancient Greece. The Prose Edda is a work of literature written in the 13th century in Iceland by a historian and scholar called Snorri Sturluson. This document is our primary source of knowledge about Norse mythology, which makes it invaluable. But it only dates from the Middle Ages, and the myth it refers to, the gods, the cosmology, all of this took shape thousands of years earlier. This means that our knowledge of what ancient Germanic tribes really believed in is uncertain. Probably that the myth evolved and formed over centuries. Some parts were added, others were forgotten. Only one version of them, a late one, is available to us. Even though there are sources, our knowledge of ancient Germanic myth is not documented over time, like it is to an extent for ancient Egypt, China, or Greece. But there are more sources to Wagner's works. It is also based on fragments of Germanic medieval literature, and one major work in particular, written in Bavaria at the beginning of the 13th century, Der Nibelungenlied, the Song of the Nibelung. It is an epic poem that tells the story of Siegfried and his wife, Kriemhild, a Burgundian princess. It is a dramatic and tragic story that ends in the destruction of a kingdom and death of all the protagonists. There are also elements taken from it and reintroduced in the Ring of the Nibelung. I'm telling you these stories following the libretto, the synopsis of the operas. But these are musical works, first and foremost, and when they were created, they were absolutely groundbreaking. They are long. In total, the 4 operas, the entire Ring cycle, lasts 15 hours. But there had been long operas before. What distinguished them was the size of the production, the ambition. The orchestra requires dozens of musicians. The settings and the number of performers were a notch above what was usual at the time. And then there is the musical genius of Wagner. Even if you're not into opera and it's just a name for you, you know more than you think. Several of his tunes, like the Wedding March from Lohengrin, another opera, or Ride of the Valkyries, are part of collective consciousness in Europe and in America. I'll put links to some of his greatest hits in the description for you. Now, as you may also know, there is like a doubtful aura around Wagner and his works because of 2 things. The first one is that he was an anti-Semite and a racist. And the second one, which really brought everything into the spotlight in the past 70 years, is that his work was embraced by the Nazis and he was Hitler's favorite composer. So he's got a bad reputation. On the second point, the fact that the Nazis praised his works, it happened long after he was dead, so he cannot really be held accountable for this. It's not hard to guess why, though. It is because of the topics and the style. As I told you before, Wagner's operas can be associated with the rise of European nationalism in the 19th century, and they glorified a supposed ancient Germanic people, a very mythical and theoretical one because, as we've seen, it didn't really exist as a single entity. Stylistically, his pieces were spectacular, imposing, which was just the kind of aesthetics the Nazi regime went for. Most experts agree that it wouldn't make much sense to turn Wagner into a precursor of fascism or of the Nazi Party. He was never an influent intellectual, and nothing of what he wrote, be it music or text, ever served as the basis for racial laws or to lay the foundations of a totalitarian regime. First, he was a romantic composer, and like many others at the time, he produced works that were intended to push the limits, to convey emotions, and also reinforce the nationalist movement. But at the time there was no shortage of intellectuals, historians, scholars, and other artists and musicians who did exactly the same, from Russia to Italy to France to the UK. All of these people had no way to know, and probably didn't wish, that nationalism could become an ingredient of horrible wars that would happen decades later. Actually, at the time, Wagner composed The Ring over a period of 26 years, from 1848 to 1874. And at the time, nationalism was perceived as a revolutionary and unifying movement in nations like Italy or Germany in particular. This is the time when they completed their unification. It came with a dream of unity and independence. The other point, Wagner's racism, and more specifically anti-Semitism, is more of a problem because it's true. He repeatedly expressed it along his life, including in a pamphlet against Jewish music composers. It took him time to find success, and bitterness and resentment were probably a factor, but he attacked successful Jewish composers of German origin, like Felix Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer. Mendelssohn is still well known. Meyerbeer is a bit forgotten, but at the time he was a big name of the opera world. He was German, but he found fame and success in Paris, and in the 19th century he was considered a major composer. He went out of favor in the decades following his death. Now it's always important to put things into context. It is a fact that anti-Semitism in Europe in the 19th century, including in Germany, was widespread and often expressed publicly. But blaming it entirely on the environment and society of the time would be a bit short in the case of Wagner, because it was not regarded as an innocent, consensual opinion neither, and it was frowned upon as a cruel and ignorant feeling in many circles. Wagner published his pamphlets anonymously, which illustrates that you could not really express such a virulent anti-Semitism and remain respectable at the same time. He also had his ambiguities. There were Jews in his social circle for his entire life, including one of his best friends. So the portrait may be a bit mixed, but it doesn't make him the bravest and most likable person ever. Maybe a more important point nowadays is to know whether these works should continue to be played. They are, with the exception of Israel. One question at the center of this is to what extent an author and his work can be separated, considered separate entities. This is a completely different topic which I'm not going to talk about, but at least I, personally, don't mind. And I don't because there is not really any trace of anti-Semitic hate or prejudice in these operas. A few biographers have argued that maybe some of the villains could be caricatures of Jews, but this view is quite marginal because it is not backed by any document, and there is nothing about it in the synopsis and lyrics of any of his works. So when they are played 150 years later, they could not possibly convey any propaganda by themselves. Now we're going to move to another chapter, the third one, Siegfried. But before, let's take a look at where we are right now, in the Black Forest. The Black Forest, der Schwarzwald, is a forested, low mountain range in the southwest of Germany, in the state of Baden-Württemberg. To the south and west, it is bordered by the Rhine Valley, and to the south there is Switzerland and France to the west. It is called the Black Forest for its vegetation of dark pines, and because of the dense vegetation and mountains, it was always a more remote, less populated and more rural region than other parts of Germany. Together with the Rhine, it formed a powerful natural frontier in the past, and this is actually where the expansion of the Roman Empire stopped. Roman legions briefly crossed the Rhine, but after a major defeat in the 1st century, Rome abandoned projects to invade Germania. There are parts of the Black Forest that are quite wild, but the region is not sinister at all. It is crossed by valleys with villages that were settled in the late antiquity and Middle Ages. In valleys that are not easily accessible, industrialization arrived very late, but it took its toll on the Black Forest because the land was rich in ore and it was exploited for wood, to such an extent that at some point in the 19th century it had been almost entirely deforested and had to be replanted. It now looks much better. From the 17th century, clockmakers appeared in the valleys, like in Switzerland to the south. At the start it was an activity during the winter for farmers. They made wooden cuckoo clocks. In the 19th century, this provided the basis for a watch and precision engineering industry. But away from pretty villages, there are parts of the forest that remain constantly dark under the dense vegetation. And there's a number of legends surrounding these almost impenetrable areas: werewolves, fairies, ghosts. The brothers Grimm lived near the Black Forest in their childhood, and the forest inspired some of their best-known tales, like Snow White and Hansel and Gretel. So it is a good place to make a stop and think about all the stories that have haunted this region around the River Rhine for centuries. And speaking of stories, let's move on to the third part of the Ring of the Nibelung, Siegfried. Several years had passed since the death of Sigmund, the escape of Sieglinde, and the sentence inflicted to Brunhilde, the Valkyrie moved by the love of two mortals. Months after her escape, Sieglinde had been found by a dwarf when she was in labor, and not whatever dwarf, a Nibelung, a blacksmith, the brother of the dwarf that had stolen the Rhinegold and made the magic ring. Years earlier, he had been forced by his brother to make the magic helmet we talked about in our first story. Sieglinde had died giving birth to her son, Siegfried. He had been named Siegfried as instructed by the Valkyrie in her last hours of freedom. And the dwarf had fostered and educated Siegfried, who had grown to become a brave, impulsive but very strong young man. The material heroes are made of. The dwarf had not taken care of Siegfried innocently. He hoped to use him to recover his brother's ring for himself. For the moment, the ring was still in the possession of the giant, who had morphed into a dragon and watched his treasure, including the ring, in a cave in the depth of a forest. The dwarf tried to forge a sword for Siegfried, but the boy was so strong that every time he used one of these swords, they broke. He had kept the fragments of Sigmund's sword, the sword Nothung, that Sieglinde carried with her, but the dwarf had never been able to reforge it. One day, as Siegfried was away, the dwarf received the visit of a mysterious old man. In reality, the old man was Wotan in disguise. The ruler of gods had not abandoned his plans to make a hero recover the ring for him, and he watched Siegfried. Wotan revealed to the dwarf that the only person that would be able to reforge the sword Nothung and arm Siegfried would be he who does not know fear, leaving the dwarf puzzled. But when Siegfried returned, the dwarf understood. The one who did not know fear was Siegfried. Since he was unable to reforge the sword himself, he let Siegfried try, and Siegfried could. He succeeded by shredding the metal, melting it, and casting it anew. The dwarf was treacherous. He told Siegfried he would now take him to the dragon's lair. But before, he brewed a poison drink to offer Siegfried after the dragon would have been slain. He planned to kill his protégé once he would have slain the dragon and keep the treasure and the ring for himself. The two departed to the dragon's lair. The entrance of the dragon's cave was deep into the forest, and the dragon was sleeping inside, ready to wake up any time an intruder would approach. At daybreak, the two arrived, but they were not alone. Wotan, in disguise as an old man, was also near the entrance, staying hidden, and so was the Nibelung dwarf from the Rhinegold story, who never accepted the loss of his ring, and now lived near the cave's entrance, waiting for the moment when he would be able to recover his treasures. He hid too when his brother and Siegfried arrived. Siegfried entered the cave and woke up the dragon. The dragon was strong, and no mere human could have ever vanquished it. But Siegfried was the grandson of Wotan. He was armed with the sword Nothung, and he was so fast and agile that the dragon could not hit him. He finally managed to stab the monster in the heart with his sword, and the dragon agonized. But when Siegfried withdrew his sword from the dragon's heart, his hands were burnt by the dragon's blood. He put his finger in his mouth to taste the blood, and this gave him the power to understand the language of animals and read the thoughts of living creatures. When Siegfried exited the cave, carrying the ring and the magic helmet, the dwarf, the foster parent, proceeded with the next phase of his plan and offered him the poison drink. But Siegfried could now read the treacherous thoughts, and he understood the dwarf was trying to get rid of him. He stabbed the dwarf. Siegfried could now understand the language of birds too, and he heard a wood bird sing to him about a woman sleeping on a rock surrounded by fire. Following the bird, he arrived where Brunhilde, the Valkyrie, had been sleeping since before his birth. The fire circle was terrifying, but Siegfried ignored fear, and he crossed it. Brunhilde was the first woman he had ever seen, which at first made him afraid for the first time in his life. But he resolved to kiss her, which woke her up from her magical sleep. As the two stared in each other's eyes, they felt an irrepressible love mounting from the deepest of their souls and bodies. This was the third part of the ring, Siegfried, but stay alert, because the last part is beginning. The end is approaching. It is now time for Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods. Siegfried and Brunhilde were still on a mountaintop, surrounded by magic fire. The flame of their new love was intact, but Brunhilde knew she couldn't keep the hero and had to send him off to new adventures. Little did she know that sending him away would start a tragic chain of events with incalculable consequences for them, the gods, and the entire world. She urged him to keep their love in mind and come back later, and gave him her shield and her horse. As a pledge of fidelity, Siegfried gave her the ring, the most powerful artifact in the world, that had already caused so many deaths since it had been forged by the Nibelung dwarf. Siegfried started a new journey and took the direction of the river Rhine. News of Siegfried's exploits and Brunhilde's awakening had reached regions nearby, and by the Rhine there was a town and a castle owned by the Gibirungs, a noble dynasty. Their lord was Gunther. He had a sister, Gudrune, but behind the scenes, the most powerful man was Gunther's half-brother and chief minister, Hagen, a manipulative and ambitious man with a taste for treason and intrigues. Gunther the Lord and his sister Gudrune were still single. Hagen had heard that Siegfried would soon arrive at the hall of the Gibirungs, and he suggested a plan. Gudrune would make Siegfried forget Brunhilde the Valkyrie and fall in love with her with a potion. He would be a perfect husband. And once Siegfried would have forgotten his past, he could win Brünnhilde for Gunther. The two, Gudrune and Gunther, agreed enthusiastically to the plan. But Hagen was manipulating them. His real plan was to put his hands on the ring and use its power. Soon Siegfried arrived, and Gunther extended his hospitality to the hero, who was unaware of the Gibelung's real intentions. The power to read thoughts given by the dragon's blood had already vanished. Gudrune offered him the love potion as a drink, and Siegfried toasted to his love for Brünnhilde for the last time. The potion worked. Siegfried immediately lost his memory of the Valkyrie and fell in love with Gudrune instead. In his drugged state, he offered to win a wife for Gunther, who told him about Brünnhilde and the magic circle of fire that only a fearless hero could cross. Gunther and Siegfried swore blood brotherhood and left for Brünnhilde's mountain, leaving Hagen gloating that the masters he pretended to serve were in fact bringing the ring to him. Siegfried arrived to the fire circle, and using the power of the magic helmet, he took the appearance of Gunther to cross it. Then he claimed Brünnhilde as his wife. She resisted violently, but was overpowered, and he snatched the ring from her hand to place it on his own, unaware that he was the previous bearer of the ring, and that the woman he was brutalizing was his former love. Brünnhilde was taken by force to the hall of the Gibelungs, and all their vassals were called for the wedding with Gunther. As the ceremony began, Brünnhilde was astonished to see Siegfried here. He appeared to her under the form of Gunther when he took back the ring, and she realized that she had been betrayed when she saw the ring on his hand. In front of Gunther's vassals, she accused Siegfried of having seduced her himself before and having betrayed his promises. Siegfried swore this was untrue, sincerely, as he had no memory of all this. The wedding took place, but as the guests were attending the party, Gunther, Brünnhilde, and Hagen stayed apart. Hagen suggested Siegfried should be killed, because Gunther had been humiliated at his own wedding, and the Lord agreed. So did Brünnhilde, heartbroken by what she believed to be the treason of her only true love. She told him that Siegfried could be vulnerable to a stab in the back, and the conspirators decided to lure Siegfried on a hunting trip and murder him. A few days later, the hunt took place. At one point, Siegfried stayed away from the hunting party and went to the bank of the Rhine. There, he met the 3 Rhine maidens who were still mourning the loss of the Rhinegold, and the nymphs urged him to return the ring to avoid its curse. But he refused and rejoined the hunters, sealing his fate. While the hunters were resting, Hagen stabbed him in the back, and Siegfried died, recollecting his awakening of Brünnhilde and understanding he had been drugged and manipulated since he arrived at the hall of the Nibelungs. Hagen tried to take the ring, but as he approached, the hand of Siegfried's body rose threateningly, and the traitor recoiled in fear. Siegfried's corpse, still with the ring, was transported to the river's bank, where a huge funeral pyre was assembled. Heartbroken, desperate, and devoid of will to live, Brunhilde took the ring and told the Rhine maidens to claim it from her ashes once fire has cleaned it from its curse. And before her last ride into the flames, where she would find the death she wished for, she instructed ravens sent by Wotan to watch the scene, to fly by the magic fire created by Loge and return to their master in Valhalla. The flames from the pyre rose and rose, consuming the bodies of Siegfried and Brunhilde, and as if they were multiplied by the sorrow and rage of the two dead lovers, they expanded to the forest nearby, to the city, and to the whole of the Nibelungs that caught fire and collapsed. A red glow suddenly appeared in the sky. Far away, in the realm of gods, Valhalla was also in flames, consumed by the fire brought by Loge and the ravens. As gods and men alike were consumed in the flames, the Rhine overflowed its banks, and the Rhine maidens swam to claim the ring. Hagen the traitor tried to stop them, but they dragged him into the depth and drowned him. On this apocalyptic vision, the death of a world, and maybe soon the birth of another, our story ends. This is all for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the story, and you can now let go and fall asleep. The sound of our campfire and the peace of the forest are still here to lull you to sleep, and will accompany you for a little while. Sweet dreams.